have three prime directives when I'm analyzing a movie: to determine what a movie is trying to accomplish, to determine if it effectively manages that, and to determine if that goal is worthwhile. My directive 4, as it were, the thing that conflicts with those directives but is impossible to avoid, is my personal bias. I can be fair and constructive, but as a person with opinions and feelings and preferences and idiosyncrasies, I can never be 100% unbiased. Ah well, I am only human after all. Alright, movie, I'm Captain Logan, and good or bad, you're getting reviewed. The following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this movie, you might want to before watching this review. In 1987, Orion Pictures took a chance on a truly unique film. Although it was influenced by a number of science fiction and comic book properties, it was wholly original. The story of a courageous cop gunned down by drug lords and resurrected as a machine. It appealed to a wide array of demographics despite its R rating, and a title that was perceived by the studio as silly and low rent because it's such a dense, layered piece that can be appreciated on numerous levels. Robocop is a high-octane revenge thriller. It's a social satire, poking fun of and exposing the dangers of out-of-control capitalism and extreme materialism. It's a science fiction epic in the tradition of Frankenstein, about a creature craving its own individuality and freedom that turns on its creator and that asks existential questions about the nature of humanity and identity. And it's a comic book-esque superhero adventure about a man who derives great superhuman abilities out of a horrific tragedy and discovers he must make enormous personal sacrifices in order to be the noble hero he's always fancied himself as. Robocop is a serious human drama, a hilarious, over-the-top, absurd comedy, a socially conscious examination of the culture of its time, and a rousing popcorn action movie. And it never stops being one of these and turns into something else. All of these modes are working in concert to create a cohesive tale that's difficult to neatly box into a single category. What makes a movie like this one instantly special is the grace and command of the storytelling, given the monumental risk that an audience might not pick up on the satirical tone or the thoughtful exploration of the human condition. The movie has to work as an effect picture, and it has to be a good time, or it has the potential to cave under the weight of its heavy, blatant themes. Paul Verhoeven expertly managed to make the film both artistic and relentlessly entertaining, with the exception of viewers who were just too queasy at the sight of blood and gore to appreciate the off-the-rails violence. There's something in this film for everybody. It's already impressive just watching the movie to laugh out loud at a frog-shaped military robot shooting round after round into an idiot company executive, which is, by the way, elongated and quite a bit funnier in the director's cut. And then cringe in terror as our hero is even more violently ripped to shreds by gangsters only 25 minutes in. It's even more impressive that the film manages that balancing act when you know that the movie, according to a DVD featurette, was a nightmare to make, that everyone working on it was much of the time absolutely miserable between the heat filming in Dallas and the insanity of figuring out the suit design and how Peter Weller was going to move in it, since all the work he did with a mime coach was for naught and he couldn't do any of it in that 40-pound behemoth of a costume. A film that, by all rights, might have been a total disaster ultimately proved to be an incredibly dense package. Like Robocop himself, there's much more than meets the eye, and a great deal more heart and humanity as you continue to peel back its layers. Clocking it at only 100 minutes and with a budget of just $13 million, Robocop is an economic and efficient storytelling machine. It gets in and gets out fast, with no posturing, no self-important moral speeches, no lengthy backstory scenes, nothing but the cold, hard reality of this exaggerated, pseudo-futuristic world, laced with hard-edged satire. Not a minute is wasted. Yet despite that flavor of indifference, or perhaps thanks to it, the movie manages to tell an undeniably human and endearing story. Giving it only a cursory glance, it would be easy to miss just how much of a superhero movie this is, but it belongs as much in that category as Batman or Spider-Man, as it includes an inordinate amount of familiar elements found in the modern epic hero's journey. It's also significantly influential to the future of superhero properties, especially stylistically. Dark, gritty, and violent was where it was at for most superhero properties for a long time after Batman, but perhaps Robocop, if not solidifying that tone first, at least set the stage and prepared a lot of people for Batman, released just 2 years later. There are a lot of Frank Miller influences in this film, themes of urban decay, media influence on public perception, impotent, apathetic government, and it's interesting that Dark Knight Returns seems to have had a greater impact on this film than it did the Batman movie that got made, partially because of the success of that graphic novel. No surprise that Frank Miller himself was asked to write the sequel. It's also interesting that the trailers for this film outright call Robocop a superhero, despite it being a highly graphic and explicit rated R film during a time where the general public, much more so than today, considered superheroes to be exclusively for children. But comics and superheroes were certainly in the back of the minds of Michael Miner and Edward Neumeier, as well as director Paul Verhoeven, a Dutch filmmaker who had never directed American movies prior to this and who wasn't real keen on science fiction, but who took on the project because his wife saw the potential artistry between the lines of the script and talked him into it. He quickly became a big name in science fiction films, later doing Total Recall and Starship Troopers. But I digress. Comic books. The media in the film calls Robocop something parents had only previously read about in comic books, and the first bad guy Robocop takes out throws a comic book up on the counter before holding up a convenience store. It's an Iron Man comic, by the way, a conscious choice by Verhoeven, since both Robocop and Iron Man wear metal suits, and I think perhaps to foreshadow that Robocop would become a heroic figure rather than just a program machine. Like so many superheroes, Robocop becomes a vigilante, putting what he believes is right above the limited letter of the law, and in this case, above the corruption that trumps the law. Robocop has a fair amount in common with Batman. Both experience a horrible trauma that takes their family from them, both are irrevocably changed by that experience and pledge their life to the pursuit of justice. Both are incorruptible and refuse to allow anything to turn them from their convictions and belief that right is right no matter the outcome. And both are selfless, idealistic crusaders who must sacrifice their own personal desires in favor of working toward a better world. But Robocop also has the added motif of the extraordinary gift that comes out of that initial origin story and all the unfortunate responsibilities that come with it. And yes, Robocop is another superhero origin story, but unlike Fantastic Four, the origin is the story. Also importantly, it was released before the onslaught of superhero films in the 2000s when formulaic superhero origin pictures became the standard. There's nothing formulaic about Robocop. There are also so many ideas to explore, with Murphy's death and return to life, the discovery of his own humanity, and that familiar exploration of identity that comes with such a profound, arguably literal in this case, rebirth, that to open the story with an already established Robocop would be the same as setting the story of the Crow after Eric Draven has already taken out the men who murdered him. In cases like this, the origin isn't just a conceit to give the character superpowers or a flimsy motivation to want to fight crime. It's a fully realized epic journey, as internal as it is external. Death, resurrection, and essentially starting over again from childhood is quite a lot to do in one movie. That's not to say that there's nowhere you could go with this character afterward. The sequels are less than critically acclaimed, but Robocop certainly works better for continuing adventures than Eric Draven's Crow does. So at the beginning, Officer Murphy is a spunky, hot-headed cop who sees the world in black and white and is ready to go out and save it single-handedly. The classic motif of the son yearning to make his father proud, like Peter Parker with Uncle Ben or Clark Kent with his father Jonathan, is turned on its head here, and it's a father wanting to be a hero to inspire his son, represented throughout the film with the image of Murphy and then Robocop spinning his gun in his hand before he holsters it, like the son's gallant fictional TV hero T.J. Laser, who in all fairness should have been played by William Shatner. That's my biggest criticism of the whole film. William Shatner didn't play T.J. Laser. Murphy comes from a more orderly part of town, though judging by the insanely volatile world climate shown in the news segments, I doubt it's by very much, and he doesn't have the chance to have his eyes open to the degree the police department and the city at large has been corrupted by omni-consumer products. He's naive, but not the same kind of oblivious as most everybody else seems to be in this America. Lemmings who allow consumer culture to tell them what to like and what to buy, people who have forgotten how to think for themselves and who have become so desensitized to violence and death that nothing shocks them, and all the laughably obvious conspiracy and corruption goes right over their heads. Yeah, sure, the Star Wars satellite malfunctioned and shot missiles that killed over 100 people, including 2 former US presidents. How convenient. Murphy lives in his own world, one where man can make a difference and where the future is bright. Not because a creepy billboard advertising a whole city built by a single company says it is, but because he believes that by example, he can make it that way. His mistake, like so many heroes, is one of hubris. He underestimates the power his enemy wields. Young, brash, and fearless, Murphy goes up against the city's biggest crime lord minutes after he leaves the precinct the first time, and gets mercilessly gunned down by Clarence and his cackling, almost non-human thugs, whose two-dimensional barbarism is again much like that of the insidious gang in The Crow. Both movies are intentionally dumbing down those characters to comment on the dehumanization of street violence, but these are also comic book archetypes in an over-the-top satire. The good guys are very good, incorruptible, and the bad guys are pure, unadulterated evil, including Dick Jones, who's secretly working in collusion with the aforementioned most dangerous mob boss in the city, whilst having complete control of the police department. The black globe sitting on his desk is a not-so-subtle symbol of the sort of villain he is, and of course the Omni in Omnicorp is a prefix meaning everything. He's working on replacing old Detroit with an alleged safer city, owned and operated entirely by his company, and he secretly plans to let the current perpetrator of the majority of Detroit's crime operate all the new, more lucrative illegal business these 2 million new jobs are bound to facilitate. This guy is a Dr. Doom or Lex Luthor level villain. He wants nothing short of world domination. Also, like so many Batman stories, Robocop has elements of both tragedy and comedy, and it's both cynical and optimistic simultaneously. It's cynical about the way the world is, but optimistic about its hero, and therefore about mankind's potential. Robocop is perhaps the most classic role model of original superheroes created exclusively for the screen. Like Superman, he can exist in a gritty, broken world, but as long as he doesn't lose his idealism, we continue to be inspired by him. In fact, we look up to him more because he's challenged by a world that doesn't appreciate him and that resists his positive, altruistic worldview. The way Murphy went after Clarence may have been lacking in strategy. Alright, it was downright suicidal, but he had more guts than anyone else in the department, which has lost so many cops the police are considering striking, and later in the film, they do. Murphy does the right thing by going after the city's most dangerous criminal, though he doesn't know it at the time, and it's perhaps a bit convenient that that's the first bad guy he comes across. And what does he get for his courage and valor? He gets dead. In a sad, perverse way, Murphy gets what he always wanted. He gets to be a superhero. He's suddenly almost as invincible as he naively thought he was before, as though shielded by his own good intentions. And it's appropriate that this happens only half an hour into the movie. This isn't like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where all the hero's dreams come true and without any consequences. Charlie not only gets Wonka's factory, but he gets to bring his entire family with him. This is the main theme that Robocop shares with so many other superheroes. Personal sacrifice. If you want to be that larger-than-life, can do no wrong, knight in shining armor, you've got to pay for it. To make the world safer for families, you must give up your own family. In Nolan's Batman movies, Bruce can't be Batman and be with the woman he loves. Spider-Man 2 sums the whole thing up in a single line of narration from Peter Parker when he asks, "Am I not supposed to have what I want?" But in those movies, it's a choice the protagonist has to make between saving lives and living the one they want to live. In Robocop, that choice is made for Murphy, which makes it all the more heart-wrenching. Arguably, he gives up more than any other superhero ever has to. His family, his body, his identity, even his basic human rights. The man who lived by his own rules is now ruled by a set of directives programmed into his mind. This is a be careful what you wish for scenario, as if the universe heard Murphy and his partner Lewis's conversation about his son, determined he wanted to be invincible like a TV hero, and decided to force him to make the trade right there. There's a whole lot of pain and suffering for Robocop throughout the movie, but at the end of the day, it's a happy ending. It wasn't a voluntary trade-off. But it was a trade-off. Murphy gave up his life, his family, and at least outwardly his humanity in order to stamp out corruption and save his city from a power-mad maniac. This solidifies it unquestionably as a traditional superhero film. The good guy goes against the law in favor of a higher morality, and justice wins out in the end. The reason heroes so often can't have what they want and still be heroes, I think, is the same reason this movie depicts a non-functioning police department run by a corporation. Public service is at odds with personal motivation, conflict of interest. You can't have that Dick Jones mentality of who cares if it works or not, and have a police department that exists for anything other than Omnicorp's bottom line. You can't be selfish and selfless at the same time. And yet, humans so often seem to be selfish creatures by nature. We all want things, we all need things, and so the question is, can anyone ever be 100% altruistic? A character like Robocop resonates with an audience because human beings all struggle with balancing their own desires and doing the noble, selfless thing. And yet, isn't it those personal attachments that keep heroes grounded and keep their priorities in check? After all, even Robocop has a friend, Lewis, to remind him that there's hope for humanity and that not everyone is a dick, Jones, or one of the mindless yes-men who work for him. And with Dick Jones, we have another major superhero motif, the villain who creates the hero, although indirectly. Dick Jones has nothing to do with the physical creation of Robocop, and in fact kills the new vice president of the company for going behind his back and getting approval for the Robocop project when his Ed 209 malfunctioned in the boardroom. However, Dick Jones and Clarence are working together, and Clarence killed Murphy, so if it wasn't for Jones, Murphy would never have been chosen to become Robocop. It could be argued that Clarence is as much Robocop's arch nemesis as Dick Jones is, but it's analogous to the Bullseye Kingpin dynamic with Daredevil. There's the muscle, and then there's the mind and the money behind it. Robocop certainly holds both of them responsible, and they're both the same kind of villain, just using each other to get what they want, and either would turn on the other at a moment's notice if it suited them. They even verbalize the exact same worldview, word for word. Good business is wherever you find it. Perfect foils for the hero who fights for justice and fairness. Dick and Clarence believe might makes right, that other more sinister golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. Part of the film's satirical criticism of Reaganomics. Robocop also has a sidekick of sorts in Lewis, the token female supporting character in an unabashedly masculine, testosterone-charged sort of movie, although it doesn't seem to be a celebration of masculinity so much as a heightened view of the capitalistic man's world director Paul Verhoeven was observing in the 80s. Side note, in an interview on the behind-the-scenes featurette, Verhoeven says he wasn't trying to make a political statement with this movie, but rather wanted to depict America the way he saw it, without condemning or condoning. But considering the senator who holds a mayor hostage over losing an election and is concerned more about getting a new car than anything else, considering the mob thug who's been mindlessly conditioned to laugh at a disturbing sitcom every time the main character says the buzz phrase, "I'd buy that for $1, and considering our hero throws the evil tycoon out a window in its corporate America that made this corrupt nut job possible, I'd say the condemnation is firmly embedded within the satire. So anyway, I find it interesting that there's only one notable woman in the cast besides brief glimpses of Murphy's wife, and that she's the only other character in the film who shares Murphy's optimistic outlook and ultimately is the one who helps him rediscover his humanity. I'm not sure what to make of this. Lewis is certainly a tough, strong female character, but she's also the one truly compassionate, understanding figure in Robocop's life. Typically in a movie, that would be a role for your one female character, the girl who feels sorry for the injured guy and helps nurse him back to health. And yet it doesn't seem as typical as it might, because it doesn't really go to the obvious place. She's not a love interest, nor is there any real hint of a potential romance between them. I think this part easily could have been played by another man even, but I like the subtlety of how it's played. There's never any attention drawn to Lewis's gender or gender politics whatsoever, and refreshingly, Lewis isn't sexualized in any way. She just happens to be a woman, and the movie lets you decide for yourself what it's getting at, if anything. Lewis is played by Nancy Allen, by the way, who is also the mean girl Chris in Carrie. Would someone please explain to me why Nancy Allen movies keep getting remade? Robocop is an inversion of what we're used to seeing with robot characters. The machine that grows beyond its initial programming discovers it has aspirations of becoming more than the sum of its parts by interpreting its programming, and more or less becomes human. Data in Star Trek, The Terminator in Terminator 2, Robbie in iRobot. Here we're exploring the same themes, but through a very different sort of visor. The question is, what makes a man a man? Is Robocop Murphy resurrected, or is he some new entity entirely? Is he a different person the same way we all are? Profound events change his perceptions, in the same way none of us are exactly the same person from one day to the next. Or is he fundamentally changed because he's rebuilt from the ground up, and he is literally a different man? Robocop announces his name as Murphy at the end, but is he a machine that has chosen to be Murphy, or has he been Murphy all along? Well, it's all in how you look at it, and it's yet another idea explored in so many superhero stories, the identity of the man behind the mask versus the masked identity itself. But instead of a man struggling to balance the double life here, Robocop is a man who's had his life entirely stripped from him. I do have a couple questions about that, and I'll take this opportunity to address them. First, I'd like some kind of explanation as to why Murphy was picked to be Robocop over any of the other cops who were recently killed in action. If the machine is completely programmed, why does it even need to be a cop? There's no discussion at all of how much of the original man is used, presumably just his brain and a lot of his face. But why does Robocop need the brain of a cop if his memories are going to be wiped? Is it about the intuition that comes with experience? If so, how can the scientists be sure he'll retain that if they take those experiences away from him? Sometimes useful details like this are sacrificed for the sake of the simplicity of the story and one of the movie's own prime directives: less is more. I like not having all that dry information delivered through expository dialogue, but the technology is so intriguing I can't help but want to know more about it. Secondly, we're told Murphy's memories are erased, but later Murphy recalls specific, vivid, albeit short memories. I assume the scientists simply failed and Murphy's memories prevailed over the program, except later Robocop tells Lewis that he can feel his wife and son, but he can't remember them. I don't know what that means. There are a number of clever hints and clues that Murphy's personality has somehow transcended mortality and is embedded within Robocop's cold titanium husk. When Robocop goes on his first patrol, he sparks the pavement with the back of his car like Murphy did when he first left the station. It's a sign of Murphy's go-get-em, thrill-seeking attitude. Robocop is completely hard and emotionless on the outside, seems to do nothing but what he's programmed to do, and yet, subconsciously from that moment, we know Murphy is still in there somewhere. Then there's his catchphrase, "Dead or alive, you're coming with me," which he starts using almost immediately. Interesting that that's exactly what Murphy said when he went up against Clarence and his men, given that Robocop's memory was completely erased. And thanks to that catchphrase, one of Clarence's thugs recognizes him, and that starts him on his search for the truth. He spins his gun like that action hero Murphy wanted to be for his son. It's the classic warning against playing God. Nature wins out over the machine. It's really important that Murphy actually dies and that he's not just an injured man put into a robot suit. That's what really sets this movie apart from other robot and cyborg stories, and the major thematic link between Murphy's personal story and the broader satire. It's a tale about dehumanization. We see that to various degrees with characters all throughout the film. Bob is a yuppie who's climbing the ladder of success in the name of crack, prostitutes, the finer things in life. Clarence's men are savages who live for chaos, love to blow stuff up, and who murder people for sport. The doctors who try to save Murphy's life are totally apathetic and indifferent, not seeming to care whether he lives or dies, and just going through the motions, almost as if they're working on a machine and not a man, ironically before he becomes the blueprint for a machine. What makes Murphy's story so compelling is that he proves to be incorruptible. More than anyone else in the film, he is literally dehumanized, and yet he doesn't let anything or anyone compromise his sense of justice. It's interesting that his function as a programmed police officer is the one thing he has to help him past that programming and into an independently thinking person again. The 3 prime directives are what Murphy lived by in life, given to him because he's a product whose purpose is being a police officer, not because the men who gave them to him believe in those principles themselves. Thus Directive 4. Perhaps those directives were so in line with Murphy's ideology that they're what awoke what was left of Murphy within him. I am astounded by how much I care about Robocop, given how little we know about him. Usually I'd be crying foul in not getting to meet Murphy's wife or son before he's killed. How can I understand and appreciate his loss if I don't experience what he's lost along with him? But that's all part of the big mystery of whether Murphy and Robocop are truly one and the same. The movie is really stingy about the details at the beginning, but it's not because it's too lazy to fully draw its protagonist. Before he's transformed, we see everything that happens to Murphy from the standard third-person point of view. We're distanced from him because once he's Robocop, Verhoeven wants us to experience what it's like to be him. A surprising amount of the rest of the film is from the Robo-Vision perspective, and by not having a complete picture of his past, it's easier for the audience to feel what Robocop feels. So when he visits Murphy's old house and flashes upon memories of his wife and son, we have the same unfamiliarity with them that he does. We experience his confusion, his loneliness, and his isolation. That's why so little of the story is given to us in dialogue exchanges. It's all about the visceral experience. Verhoeven is brilliant at knowing when to conceal and when to reveal information. Could the movie have opened with Robocop waking up in the laboratory for the first time? If it had, we'd feel exactly like he does, totally in the dark, totally inhuman. We might discover his humanity along with him in a similar way and still root for him as he claws his way through the bowels of his mechanized psyche. That's the way Todd McFarlane did it with Spawn in the comics. The audience is clueless as the protagonist as to how he got in this nightmarish predicament. I don't think there's anything wrong with this approach inherently, as long as the protagonist starts working toward putting the pieces together and he doesn't just spend all his time sitting around brooding and trying to remember stuff. But you run the risk of having to rely too much on a lot of exposition and dialogue or intrusive flashbacks to give us that background. The genius stroke from Verhoeven is that snapshot of the man at the beginning, which allows for all those subtle clues later. We couldn't pick up on any nuances of Murphy's character shining through the machine if we didn't know something about him. Not to mention that what Robocop manages to live through seems like a larger mountain to climb if we get to see the horrific death Murphy comes back from. You also wouldn't have the Jesus allegory otherwise. We have to see the crucifixion and the resurrection in order for Robocop to be the American Jesus, as Verhoeven calls him in interviews. This is another motif he naturally shares with other superheroes, especially Superman, the Christ-like savior character who sacrifices himself for the good of humanity and sets a high bar for the rest of us to achieve. WWRD, what would Robocop do? We saw a lot of really blatant Christian symbolism in Man of Steel, where Superman was constantly compared to Jesus. This movie does that a lot better. The metaphor isn't just there to look artsy. It's a comparison that serves the story, supporting the themes of self-sacrifice and serving truth and justice even in the face of certain doom. In fact, Robocop stands for the same thing Superman does, with the exception of the American way, at least the way Verhoeven perceived it in the late 80s. And just like Superman, Robocop stands for 3 precepts, or prime directives, and certainly none of those are a directive of non-interference like in Star Trek. 1, serve the public trust. 2, protect the innocent. 3, uphold the law. Every one of these directives is constantly violated by Dick Jones and OCP. Their directives are 1, serve ourselves. 2, step on whomever we must to get what we want. And 3, break the law whenever it serves our interests. This puts Robocop immediately at odds with his creators. And Dick finds at the end that Bob picked the absolute worst possible candidate to serve their interests. A man who believes in those principles and whose original personality fits right in line with what those words actually mean. It's really fun that what finally beats Dick at the end is a product that does exactly what it's supposed to, and that his philosophy of it doesn't matter if it works as long as it turns a profit totally fails him when his defective Ed 209 robots can't protect him. Lots of poetic justice in this film. Robocop's directives are a nod to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, a lot like the Terminator's rules in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, except those were actually a little closer since he had one rule that took precedent over any other. Robocop's directives all seem equally important, and logically, one doesn't trump the other because they all work together in harmony to theoretically create justice. You serve the public trust by doing the other 2. Protecting the innocent would never violate the first rule, and upholding the law and protecting the innocent could maybe be at odds. You could have to let a criminal get away in order to protect someone, I suppose. But then, even if 1 and 2 take greater priority over 3, they're still in the order that makes the most sense. Objective 4, of course, contradicts the other 3, which is probably why it's classified until it comes into play. Not to mention that it sets up a mystery for the audience to wonder about, and it's paid off nicely in that very Superman vs. Lex Luthor confrontation between Robocop and Dick, where it's finally revealed as his great weakness. And come to think of it, Robocop's weakness is Dick's downfall in exactly the same way kryptonite poisoning is in certain Superman continuities for Lex Luthor. Directive 4 is the self-serving failsafe that would be, if these were like Asimov's laws, the real number 1, as it trumps the other 3, and there's really no way for even the most self-aware robot to interpret it in a way that would work in his favor. Robocop can't arrest a senior employee of OCP. The final scene is one of the most satisfying endings I've ever seen. Just when it seems all hope is lost, Robocop finds an unlikely ally in the founder of the company, who Dick holds hostage after Robocop reveals with video evidence that Dick killed Bob. It's such a smartly written scene. The old man, as Dick calls him, fires Dick, knowing full well that Robocop can take a shot now because he explained what Directive 4 was when he walked in the door. I like that he's not incompetent as I might have expected. As Browncoat Eric pointed out in our commentary on this movie, he's just not in control. This adds to the optimism the film leaves us with. There's hope for the future because the older ideals aren't dead. Certainly the old man isn't perfect. He probably could have done a lot more to find out what illegal ventures Dick was involved in. Then he could have fired him a long time ago. He seems to have chosen to look the other way, perhaps out of fear of reprisal from Dick, and for good reason given what happened to Bob. Yes, he gives Robocop that power to save his own hide, but I get the impression that he hasn't been comfortable with what Dick's been doing with his company since the very beginning. At the very least, he believes in putting out a good working product for his customers. I like that the man at the very top isn't the supervillain, and that he's as oblivious, or has chosen to be, as everybody else. Like another Christ figure in a sci-fi film, Neo from The Matrix, Murphy has the scales lifted from his eyes, and he realizes the world as he knows it is a lie. As outsiders looking in, we can watch the media segments and commercials and read between the lines. But Murphy is blinded by his positive outlook. He knows there's a lot of crime in old Detroit, but he believes in a system and he thinks it works. When he's murdered, he trades in his rose-tinted glasses for a gaudy visor. But even as Robocop, when he's starting to figure out who he was and who killed him, he operates under the assumption that only the crime lords are to blame. It isn't until he brings Clarence in that he even has a hint that OCP is responsible for his death as well as his resurrection. Robocop gains more self-awareness as he comes to understand the world he lives in, through initially unbiased, unfiltered eyes. With that knowledge comes the power of choice, something most of the characters in this film have either lost or chosen to live without, and so they've given up some of their humanity with it. It takes a machine-like mind that can't be seduced by the allure of things and prestige that corporate America is selling, and so Robocop, ironically, becomes the most human character in the film. And this is his opportunity for change. He can choose to accept that world as the way it is and there's nothing he can do about it, or he can continue following his directives and uphold the law. I love how he manages to make these clear choices within the restrictions of his programming. Verhoeven doesn't have to cheat and break the rules he's established to allow Robocop to find his humanity. Robocop adapts, he works around his limitations, and he's more compelling because of all these seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Those restrictions also help him not to seem immortal. He suffers as much in the suit, along with Peter Weller, as he does out of it. Or I should say, Robocop suffers as much as Murphy does. Earlier I likened Robocop to The Crow, but while the structure is very similar, one is blatantly about revenge, and the other is a little more subtle about it. In The Crow, Eric mystically gets the chance to come back solely to kill everyone who killed him. Robocop is built out of what was left of Murphy in order to uphold the law, and that's exactly what he does, by getting revenge on the punks who killed him. I love how ambiguous this all is. Is what Robocop does vengeance, or is it justice? There's no denying that Robocop goes after Clarence because he's realized what he's done to him and is tortured about it. He demonstrates that when he destroys the automated realtor at his old house after he and we are introduced to his family through flashes of bittersweet memory. Robocop must enjoy throwing Clarence through all 3 of those glass doors after what he's taken from him. He's only able to kill Clarence when arresting him is no longer an option. The police are on strike. There might not even be anyone to run the prisons, and he kind of gets lucky, put in a kill or be killed position. He has the full intention of killing Clarence Clarence the second time around, but I wonder if his program would have allowed him to do that had it not been for the circumstances. The situation is plenty believable. Dick has sent Clarence to kill Robocop because he has damning evidence against him, so it doesn't come across as a convenient plot device just to let Robocop get his vengeance. And Robocop wants to see his killers paid, but not necessarily die. He would have been fine with Clarence rotting in prison if only he'd stayed there. I think when he says he's not going to arrest him this time, it's because he knows the system is corrupt and he's neither upholding the law or protecting the innocent by giving him back to Dick Jones. So it is about vengeance, and like the Crow, the universe seems to be throwing Robocop a bone, so to speak. But he remains an optimistic figure we can look up to because we can tell he believes in justice over his personal vengeance. He's not at odds with his programming there. You know, Dick Jones isn't the real master manipulator of this movie. Paul Verhoeven is. Rarely have I seen a movie so in control of its audience's senses and emotions. He turns us into the mindless drones the movie warns us about becoming, making us lose touch with our feelings and our sense of empathy by making the violence so ridiculous we can't help but laugh at the carnage. And then he brings us back down to earth by portraying a death so gruesome we're not laughing anymore, because it's happening to a hero we're already coming to sympathize with, and because it's an execution performed by the same obnoxious, inhuman, cackling hyenas Verhoeven turned us into earlier with the boardroom scene. He uses an overly violent movie to comment on the ways in which people become desensitized to violence, and what that does to their sense of empathy. He's using a popcorn movie to discuss the dangers of a society with such low qualities of entertainment, and while he could be insulting that audience by bordering on preaching at them about why they might want to consider turning off the TV and reading a book now and then, he's simultaneously giving them a great popcorn experience. He makes us feel what it's like to be Robocop by putting us behind that visor, and he makes us want to see our hero prevail by hitting him with everything he's got. He tells so much of his story visually that I know a lot of things instinctually without even having to articulate them. Things that another script, frankly, a script I'd probably write, would spell out for me in dialogue. Intuitively, I know that I'm seeing more of Murphy's humanity shine through as the physical layers of the machine are pulled back to reveal the man's face, grotesquely pulled back over a metal facade. I love how we're over an hour in the movie before we even know for sure how much of a human face he has left, or even if he has real eyes under that visor. I also know intuitively that Robocop is essentially a child growing into adulthood, but it wasn't until I started dissecting it that I was consciously aware of all the symbolism and metaphor that gives life to that idea. It's strangely a coming-of-age story as much as it's a hero's journey or a revenge thriller. Robocop lives on baby food. His oppressive father, Dick, punishes him when he rebels. He manages to get out from under his father's thumb at the end and leaves the nest, or I guess throws his father out of the nest and onto the unrelenting asphalt below. When he's shooting the canisters of baby food, trying to realign his targeting scanners, we're witnessing a loss of innocence. His realizing the system he believed in as Murphy has failed him, and his manufacturers want to dismantle him, or rather, blow him to smithereens. By the way, I wonder what Robocop eats now that he's decided to defy his new man-made nature. Can he only eat soft foods? Or can Robocop go to Taco Bell if he wants to? Huh. Taco Bell. I must really have futuristic social satires on the brain. Another thing Verhoeven really uses to his advantage is camera placement. He's fully aware of perspective at all times, and he uses it to both enhance the themes and ideas of the piece, and to challenge his audience. Often when the camera is following Robocop, it's from underneath, to give him this vast godlike presence, which plays into the Messiah motif, and also gives him an authoritarian air. When Bob is talking to another OCP employee about Dick, ostensibly behind his back, the tense confrontation between the two is foreshadowed to the audience by the initial placement of the camera inside a stall Dick himself is using. We hear part of this initial conversation from Dick's perspective, and if we've guessed whose legs those are, it ramps up the anticipation of the inevitable backdraft. And shot composition is also used to great comedic effect, like in the scene where Robocop takes out an Ed 209 just before he goes up to the boardroom at the very end. We see him tear this mechanical monster to shreds, then he walks toward the building, he turns to face what the audience is led to believe is another Ed 209 about to give him more resistance, but curiously, Robocop gives a faint smile. I love the subtle sense of humor he's developed by this point, and walks away. We then discover what Robocop already knows, as the two Ed 209 legs come into frame without a torso attached, and we're amused to find it's the same robot he just took out as it topples unceremoniously to the ground. A lot of clever leg shots in this movie. I haven't said much about the satire yet, and that's because it speaks for itself. Briefly, though, let's touch on a few things. The framework of the media talking heads is genius, because it gives us a sense of the world at large and how completely screwed up it is, which you wouldn't as easily understand if we never heard about anything outside of Detroit. Detroit, of course, already has the reputation for being the most dangerous and corrupt city in America, but hey, they're actually protected by Robocop now. So that's an appropriate place to set this. And with these world politics, it's depicted as a symptom of a larger problem, a nationwide epidemic of big business taking over, degenerating the culture, and developing advanced technologies for the sole purpose of building their bottom line with no thought to the consequences. I think it's really interesting that the film is set in some ambiguous time in the future when it looks just like 1987, complete with all the logos, fashion styles, and car makes of the time. Yes, Robocop drives a Ford Taurus. Careful with that transmission, Robocop. It'd be embarrassing to get stalled out on the highway when you're off on patrol. And even the comics in the convenience store are from the late 80s. The writers and directors say it's the future, but the film itself gives no indication as to whether it's supposed to be an alternate present, like Watchmen, and it's ultimately a moot point because the film is obviously commenting on all the big social issues of the time. It wouldn't exactly be a satire if it was subtle about that. Yes, it's heavy-handed, but it balances that by telling a much more subtle human story, which is quite open to interpretation. And while the commentary is harsh and disturbing, it's also hysterical, often serving as comic relief to break up the heavy existential stuff. I'd argue that a lot of the news stuff and the way things are named are so clever that most people are likely to smile at a lot of it, even if they don't politically line up with the film's criticisms of society. My absolute favorite gag is the 6000 SUX. The hottest car on the market is telling you it's a clunker, and either nobody notices or no one cares because they're so used to buying into hype it's just second nature. There's a commercial for that car using stop-motion dinosaurs wreaking havoc on a city, and the slogan is "In American tradition, because bigger is better." Everything that's wrong with the society is pointedly stabbed right in the nose with that image. Dinosaurs are huge, but they're primitive and savage and brainless, which is exactly what this kind of thinking is turning people into, as illustrated by Clarence's gang. And from the malfunctioning Ed 209s, we see well before that commercial that bigger is most certainly not better. These clever details are also sometimes used for foreshadowing, like the billboard for Delta City. The future has a silver lining. If you already know the ending, you might realize that the optimism of the film is telegraphed by this ominous sign that, within the context of the plot, it's a straight-up lie, as Delta City doesn't spell hope and prosperity for the residents of Detroit, but merely more dollars for Omnicorp. However, it unintentionally predicts the future, which does have a silver lining after Dick Jones' demise. It's called Robocop. Like the 6000 SUX, very little is named without purpose. Calling the most power-mad scuzzbucket in the world Dick is a no-brainer. Murphy might be a clever play on words, as Murphy is a police officer and has the dumb luck of getting himself shot to bits his very first time out of his precinct. Murphy's Law. As I mentioned earlier, Omni means everything, and that's what OCP is trying to control, but it's also a double entendre, as it seems to produce everything under the sun as well. The name should sound foreboding to the consumer, but it's probably really just telling them, buy it all from us. There's nothing we don't sell. I'd really like to know if Omnicorp is in the real estate business, given that the automated realtor is the only super technology we see that isn't specifically said to be built by that company, which isn't just a video, by the way. It tries to negotiate a deal with Robocop before he gives it a knuckle sandwich. Since they're building an entire city, they're clearly in the architecture business. So it's entirely likely, and I think gives a lot of credence to the notion of looking at the film as an alternate 1987 with certain advancements made by one company, rather than a futuristic film. Well, finally, we have reached the end of my assessment. Robocop fulfills its function and all three of my criteria. It knows what it wants to be, a biting social satire with a human story at its heart, fueled by action. It effectively accomplishes that. The satire comes through more than crystal clear, but never overpowers and in fact contributes to the human story. And I think its intentions are more than worthwhile, as it's bold, original, thought-provoking, and worth multiple viewings. My Directive 4, my personal bias, may be getting in the way a little with my final score, but I find very little to complain about here, and a whole lot of inspired and inventive storytelling that most certainly influenced the action, superhero, and science fiction genres. I'm giving Robocop a 4 out of 4.